You're about to witness one of history's most deliberate acts of psychological warfare. For 76 days, they didn't simply imprison Marie Antoinette. They slowly, methodically stripped away her humanity piece by piece. And unbelievably, it all began with an 8-year-old boy. Forget everything you think you know about the guillotine. The blade was the mercy. What came before it was far darker. They found the one weakness she had left, and they exploited it with a level of cruelty that still stains the historical record. This is the story of prisoner 280, and I'm going to show you exactly what they did to her. It's July 3rd, 1793, in the dead of night at the Temple prison in Paris. Boots slam against the stone floor, echoing through the corridors. Heavy, deliberate, drawing closer. Marie Antoinette is asleep beside her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles. Her hand rests over his chest. She hasn't allowed him out of her sight since they executed his father 6 months earlier. Suddenly the door bursts open. 6 guards storm inside, carrying a document, an official order. They've come for the boy. What happens next will shake the prison walls for a full hour. The former queen becomes something raw and primal. A mother trying to save her child with every ounce of strength she has left. She throws herself against the door. She screams until her voice tears. She begs them to take her instead. But here's what makes this moment even more horrifying. This isn't random brutality, and it's not chaos. It's intentional, calculated. The revolutionaries had finally realized something crucial. They couldn't break Marie Antoinette with torture, starvation, or humiliation, but they could break her with her own love. And they were about to use her son to destroy her in ways that would make the guillotine feel like a mercy. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is far darker than you can imagine. But before we go into the nightmare that followed, you need to understand who Marie Antoinette actually was. Because the woman they tormented in 1793 was nothing like the villain the revolutionaries painted her to be. She was born Maria Antonia in Vienna in 1755, an Austrian archduchess and the youngest daughter of Empress Maria Theresa. At just 14 years old, she was married off to the future King Louis XVI of France. It wasn't a love story. It was politics. Austria and France needed an alliance, and she was the price. From the moment she arrived, the French court despised her. She was Austrian, which made her an enemy in their eyes. She was young, inexperienced, and unfamiliar with French customs. Courtiers mocked her accent, her clothing, her manners, everything she did. Even her own husband kept his distance for years. Their marriage wasn't consummated until 7 years later, a humiliation that became gossip across Europe. So she did what any isolated, lonely teenager might do. She escaped into pleasures, extravagant hairstyles, lavish gowns, parties at her private retreat, the Petit Trianon. Meanwhile at Ars, the French people were starving, and her spending made her an easy target. They branded her Madame Deficit. Did she actually say let them eat cake when told the people had no bread? No, it was propaganda. But the accusation stuck. The damage was done. By the time the revolution exploded in 1789, Marie Antoinette had become France's favorite scapegoat. She wasn't a monster, she was a foreigner, a woman and a queen, 3 things guaranteed to make her the perfect target. And when the monarchy fell, The revolutionaries needed someone to blame for centuries of royal excess. They chose her. But here's the detail people forget. By 1793, Marie Antoinette was no longer the carefree girl with towering wigs and sparkling gowns. She was a mother of 4 who had already watched her oldest son die of tuberculosis at age 7. She'd watched her husband dragged to the guillotine. She had spent months locked inside the temple prison with her surviving children, knowing any day could be their last. She had already lost everything: her crown, her freedom, her husband, even her country. And yet the revolutionaries were about to show her that she still had more to lose. Let me paint a picture of the temple prison itself, because this place was designed to break people long before they ever faced the guillotine. It was a medieval fortress originally built by the Knights Templar, dark, damp, and suffocating. After King Louis XVI was executed in January 1793, Marie Antoinette and her 2 surviving children, 14-year-old Marie-Thérèse and 8-year-old Louis-Charles, were locked in the tower under constant guard. At first, they were kept together. Marie Antoinette tried desperately to maintain some sense of normal life for her children. She taught them lessons. She prayed with them. She held them close at night when the sounds of angry revolutionary mobs echoed through the streets outside. But the guards were watching, always watching, taking notes, and reporting everything back to the Committee of Public Safety, the revolutionary government now controlling France. And they noticed something. Marie Antoinette could endure almost anything except danger to her children. So they began experimenting with psychological torture. First, they restricted her access to the children's rooms, forcing Marie Antoinette to beg for permission just to see her own son and daughter. Then they placed additional guards inside their living quarters, men who sat silently in the corner, staring, listening, recording every detail, every conversation, every moment of affection, every tear. The children weren't even allowed to speak German, their mother's native language. They were required to use French only, which meant even their most private family moments were monitored and controlled by the state. Marie Antoinette began to fall apart. Her hair, once light brown, started turning white from overwhelming stress, a condition later called Marie Antoinette syndrome. And yes, it's a real documented phenomenon. She stopped eating. She developed internal hemorrhaging that she tried desperately to hide from the guards. But she kept going because her children were still with her, and the revolutionaries knew that if they truly wanted to break her, they had to take that away. July 3rd, 1793, the night that would define Marie Antoinette's final torment. Let me walk you through what happened, because the primary sources, the actual accounts of people who witnessed it, are devastating. It's around 10 p.m. Marie Antoinette has just put 8-year-old Louis-Charles to bed. He sleeps in the same room. She has not allowed him out of her sight since his father's execution. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse, and her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, are in nearby rooms. Then they hear it. Boots. Multiple men climbing the tower stairs. The door bursts open. 6 municipal guards enter, led by a man holding an official decree from the Committee of Public Safety. They have come to take Louis-Charles. He is to be re-educated by the Republic, separated from what they call his mother's corrupting influence. Marie-Thérèse later wrote about this moment in her memoir. She described how her mother transformed instantly from composed and dignified to feral. Marie Antoinette threw herself between the guards and her sleeping child. She grabbed Louis Charles and held him so tightly he woke up crying, confused. And then she began screaming, not the controlled objections of a former queen, but raw, animalistic screams. "You will not take him. You will have to kill me first. He's just a child." The guards tried to reason with her. The order came from the highest authority. She had no choice. She didn't care. For a full hour, 60 long minutes, she physically blocked the doorway, refusing to let them near him. The guards threatened her. They threatened the boy. They threatened her daughter. They warned her that if she didn't comply, they would use force, and someone would get hurt. Marie Antoinette kept fighting. Finally, Madame Elisabeth begged her to stop. Louis Charles was sobbing, terrified. Marie-Thérèse was hysterical. The guards were becoming violent. Marie Antoinette's resistance finally broke. She kissed Louis Charles one last time and whispered something to him. Words we will never know. Then she watched 6 grown men drag her 8-year-old son down the tower stairs, his screams echoing until they disappeared into silence. She collapsed onto the floor and didn't move for hours. But here's where the cruelty becomes almost unimaginable. The revolutionaries didn't just take her son. They handed him over to a man named Antoine Simon, a radical cobbler chosen specifically to reshape the child. And Simon's methods were horrifying. Louis Charles was locked in a dark, windowless room. He was forced to wear the red revolutionary cap and sing anti-monarchy songs. He was trained to curse his mother, to call her vile names, to repeat accusations of treason and conspiracy. And when he refused, Simon beat him, starved him, isolated him, and broke him mentally until he was too weak to resist. Within weeks, Louis Charles was repeating every line they fed him, accusations so monstrous and so sickening that they would soon be used as weapons against his mother in the worst possible way. Marie Antoinette didn't know the details, but she knew her son was suffering, and she knew she was powerless to protect him. And that's when they moved her to the conciergerie. On August 1st, 1793, less than a month after her son was taken, guards stormed into Marie Antoinette's room in the Temple prison at 2 a.m. There was no explanation, no warning, only an order. You're being transferred. They separated her from her daughter and her sister-in-law. She begged to say goodbye. They refused. They dragged her down the tower stairs, threw her into a carriage, and drove her through the dark streets of Paris to a place called the Conciergerie. If you know anything about the French Revolution, you know that name. The Conciergerie was called the antechamber to the Guillotine. It was where prisoners spent their final days before execution. Marie Antoinette wasn't just being moved, she was being prepared for death. But the revolutionaries wanted to make those final days as psychologically devastating as possible. She was assigned prisoner number 280, not the former queen, not even her name, just a number. Her cell was tiny, roughly 12 feet by 8 feet. The walls were damp stone, streaked with mold. Inside was a thin straw mattress, a wooden table, 2 chairs and a chamber pot. A single candle provided the only light. There were no windows, just the suffocating darkness of a medieval dungeon. And here's the truly insidious part. They gave her a privacy screen, a simple folding divider so she could change clothes or use the chamber pot in private. Sounds like a humane gesture, right? It wasn't. The privacy screen was nothing but theater. Because inside that cell, at all times, were two armed guards. They sat silently in the corner and watched her every moment. When she ate, when she slept, when she changed her clothes behind that useless screen, when she used the chamber pot, when she prayed, when she cried. Constant, unblinking surveillance. This wasn't about security. She was a middle-aged woman in failing health, locked in a dungeon. This was psychological torture designed to strip away her last shred of dignity and humanity. Historical accounts describe how Marie Antoinette tried desperately to maintain her composure. She would sit for hours staring at the wall, her face blank and emotionless. Guards reported that she barely spoke, barely moved, barely ate. But at night, when she believed the candlelight hid her face, they heard her crying, soft broken whispers of her son's name, Louis Charles, Louis Charles, over and over. Her health deteriorated rapidly. She developed severe hemorrhaging, likely caused by uterine cancer or extreme stress. She bled through her clothing and had to ask the guards for rags. A humiliating request made in front of men who stared at her without mercy. Her hair, now completely white, began falling out in clumps. She was only 37 years old, yet she looked decades older. And then came the trial. October 14th, 1793. At 8 a.m., Marie Antoinette was dragged from her cell and taken to the Revolutionary Tribunal. Calling it a trial is misleading. This was a performance. The verdict had been decided long before she entered the courtroom. But the revolutionaries needed a spectacle, something dramatic enough to justify her execution to the public and to history. The room was packed. Revolutionary officials, journalists, and citizens crowded in, eager to see the former queen disgraced. The prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, stepped forward, ready to unleash a storm of accusations: treason, conspiracy, financial corruption. Marie Antoinette sat pale and gaunt in the defendant's chair, dressed in widow's black. For 2 days they hurled charges at her: that she conspired with Austria, that she drained the national treasury, that she organized counter-revolutionary plots. She answered each accusation with calm intelligence. She refuted lies, acknowledged mistakes without groveling, and refused to break. So Fouquier-Tinville played his final, most vicious card. He called a witness, Jacques Hébert, a radical journalist. Hébert repeated accusations supposedly made by Marie Antoinette's 8-year-old son, Louis Charles. The boy, after months of starvation, isolation, and relentless coaching, had been forced to claim that his mother had committed incest with him. Let that sink in. They accused her of sexually abusing her own child, using testimony extracted from an 8-year-old boy through torture, and they presented it in a public courtroom filled with hundreds of spectators. The room fell silent. Even the usually bloodthirsty crowd seemed stunned by the horror of the accusation. Marie Antoinette had remained stoic through every insult and every lie. But this broke her. She stood, her voice, usually calm, cracking with raw, wounded humanity. "I appeal to all the mothers present in this room," she said, her eyes burning. "Is there among you a single one who would not shudder at such an accusation?" She wasn't speaking to the judges. She spoke directly to the women in the crowd, mothers, daughters, sisters. For the first time in the trial, she wasn't defending herself as a queen. She was speaking as a mother whose child had been turned into a weapon against her. Nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge made against a mother, she continued. I appeal to all mothers who are listening to me. The courtroom erupted. Women who had come to mock her execution were suddenly in tears. Even some officials shifted uncomfortably. It was too much, too cruel, too far. But Fouquier Tinville didn't care. He bulldozed through the rest of the proceedings. At 4 a.m. on October 16th, after a trial that lasted barely 2 days and offered no real evidence, Marie Antoinette was found guilty of high treason and crimes against the state. The sentence: death by guillotine. The execution was scheduled for later that very day. She was taken back to her cell and given only a few hours to prepare for death. Back in the darkness of her dungeon, with dawn approaching and only hours left to live, Marie Antoinette was finally given a pen, paper, and ink. She didn't write a political message. She didn't curse the revolution. She didn't plead for mercy. She wrote a letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, who was still imprisoned in the temple with Marie Antoinette's daughter. It is one of the most heartbreaking documents in all of history. Let me read you parts of it. It is to you, sister, that I write for the last time. I have just been condemned, not to a shameful death. That is only for criminals, but to rejoin your brother, innocent like him. I hope to show the same firmness in my last moments. I am calm, as one is when one's conscience reproaches one with nothing. I deeply regret having to abandon my poor children. You know that I lived only for them and for you, my good and tender sister. She went on to forgive her enemies, to ask pardon for any wrongs she had committed, and to beg her sister-in-law to care for her children. May my son never forget his father's last words, which I expressly repeat to him. Let him never seek to avenge our death. She poured every ounce of her remaining love onto that page. Her final thoughts as a mother, as a sister, as a human being facing the void. The letter filled 4 pages. She signed it simply, Marie Antoinette. Then she handed it to a guard. Here's the devastating truth. The letter was never delivered. Her jailers intercepted it, and it disappeared into a revolutionary archive. Madame Elisabeth never read it. Neither did her daughter. The letter wasn't discovered until decades later, long after everyone Marie Antoinette loved was gone. Her final words to her family died in silence. October 16th, 1793, 11 a.m. The executioner's assistant entered Marie Antoinette's cell and ordered her to prepare. Every step was designed to strip away the last traces of her identity. First, the dress. She was wearing a simple black mourning gown she'd worn since her husband's death. The guard ordered her to remove it and put on a plain white chemise, the uniform of the condemned. She asked to change in private. The guard refused. She had to undress in front of the men who had watched her for months. Second, the hair. Her hair, now completely white and brittle, was crudely hacked off with shears. No ceremony, no care, just rough hands and sharp blades cutting away one of her final physical dignities. Third, the binding. Her hands were tied behind her back with coarse rope, so tight it cut into her wrists. She flinched and said quietly, "You did not bind my husband's hands like this." The guard ignored her. At 11 a.m., she was led out of the conciergerie into blinding daylight. She had been in that dark cell for 76 days. The sunlight hurt her eyes. She expected a closed carriage, the small mercy her husband had been granted. Instead, there was a rough open wooden cart called a tumbril, the kind used to transport animal carcasses. She was forced to climb into the cart and sit on a plank, hands bound, exposed to the entirety of Paris. As the cart lurched forward through the streets, thousands of people lined the route, screaming, jeering, spitting, throwing garbage. One man sat at a window, sketching furiously. Jacques Louis David, the revolutionary artist who had voted for her death. His drawing survives. It shows a thin, hollow-eyed woman sitting rigidly upright, her face a mask of grim dignity as the world howled for her blood. The journey to the Place de la Révolution took over an hour.